passage we're dealing with, John chapter 7, verses 14 through 24. Let's take a look at it. As you remember, Jesus had refused to go to the Feast of Tabernacles when his brothers had asked him to do it. They're like, well, if you want to make a big name for yourself, you need to go up there now. And he says, no, I'm not going to go up right now. And later he does it, and this is where we pick up. Not until halfway through the feast did Jesus go up to the temple courts and begin to teach. The Jews were amazed and asked, how did this man get such learning without having studied? And Jesus answered, my teaching is not my own. It comes from him who sent me. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. He who speaks on his own does so to gain honor for himself, but he who works for the honor of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? You are demon-possessed, the crowd answered. Who is trying to kill you? And Jesus said to them, I did one miracle, and you are all astonished. Yet because Moses gave you circumcision, though actually it did not come from Moses, but from the patriarchs, you circumcise a child on the Sabbath. Now, if a child can be circumcised on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing the whole man on the Sabbath? Stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. All right, let's try to break this all down. First off, in this particular little scenario, this confrontation between Jesus and the Jewish leaders, they begin to question Jesus' teaching. Not because he was a bad teacher, not because he didn't know how to teach or he wasn't making an impression. In fact, he was drawing crowds, and everybody was amazed at how well he could teach. What was bothering them was this: how did this man get such learning without having studied? Apparently, they're looking at Jesus and going, the problem with this guy is he didn't go to a rabbinical school. He didn't study with one of us. He didn't take lessons from us, and he's not only that, but he's not following what a good rabbi should be doing. He should be using the acceptable style, which is quoting previous judgments and quoting other rabbis. In fact, it's said in other parts of other Gospels that Jesus spoke not like the traditional rabbis, in that he spoke under his own authority. He didn't go around quoting other judgments. He didn't go around quoting other rabbis, and they were quite upset about him. He's not one of us. He didn't go to the right schools. He didn't study under the right rabbis. Why does everybody like him so much? He shouldn't be a teacher. And Jesus' reply is simple. My teaching is not my own. It comes from him who sent me. In other words, he tells them, you know what? I am quoting my teacher because my teacher happens to be God. Directly, I'm quoting from the one who sent me. I'm following exactly the form that I should be following. I'm trained not in your rabbinical schools, but I'm trained by God himself. So, since I'm quoting God, why don't you recognize his teaching? Isn't that kind of a strange thing? You would think that the rabbis would recognize God's teaching. This week, earlier, I posted on Facebook kind of an unusual story that happened. I don't know how many of you people saw this. How many of you know that National Public Radio, for the last 29 years, on the 4th of July, always reads the Declaration of Independence out loud on the radio? How many of you have heard that? Okay. So this year, they decided to do something different. Not only did they read it on radio like they normally do, they decided to tweet it, which was a whole series of tweets that they sent out. And apparently, people did not recognize our own Declaration of Independence as they began to criticize NPR and say, you guys should be defunded, you're being too political, right? You're attacking our current administration. And it's like, no, they're not. They're just tweeting out the Declaration of Independence, and people didn't recognize it. And I'm sitting there saying to myself, how is it possible that people cannot recognize famous phrases like "in the course of human events" or "the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness"? How can you not recognize? And then I realize I'm dealing with students. No, I'm not. I always give students a hard time, I know. I'm sorry, I shouldn't do that. No, but I can apparently they must have missed part of it or something. I don't know what happened. But how do you take something that famous and not recognize it? It's because you're too caught up in something else. It's because people were so caught up in becoming defensive about a certain position, political position, rather than engaging their brain and understanding what was really going on. And this is exactly what's happening with these Jewish leaders. They're so caught up in defending their religious position, they don't even recognize when God is speaking to them. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. See, when you're doing what God tells you to do, you begin to recognize it in your own life, that yes, this is what God teaches. When you're out there acting and living out God's word, you recognize the word when it comes. He who speaks on his own does so to gain honor for himself, but he who works for the honor of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. Oftentimes, these religious leaders, these rabbis, would speak to honor themselves. They wanted the adoration of the crowds. They wanted people to look at them and say, oh, what a great teacher he is. Oh, and he studied under a great teacher who studied under a great teacher. And they were trying to bring honor to themselves. And Jesus is saying, I'm not trying to bring honor to myself. I'm trying to bring honor to the one who sent me, which is God. If you're looking out for your own honor, there's probably something false about you. But if you're looking out for the honor of God, indeed, there is truth within you. By the way, I just want to point out, for somebody who didn't go to rabbi school, he builds a beautiful rabbinic argument here. There's structure to it. I'm sure it probably enraged the Jewish leaders who were listening to him because this is the structure of the argument. That A, false messenger, B, seeks glory for himself. And then, of course, in the middle is where you always have the flip, right? The messenger seeking glory for one who sent him. A is a true messenger. This is beautiful, poetic Hebrew form, a perfect rabbinic argument. And I'm sure when they heard it, they went, how does he do that? That is so irritating that he can form a perfect rabbinic argument and he didn't go to one of our schools. Anyway. Has not Moses given you the law, yet not one of you keeps the law? Now this is interesting. When we're talking about the Jewish leaders, and most of them were either Sadducees or Pharisees, when we're talking about the Pharisees especially, these people were famous for keeping the law, keeping it in such minute detail that you would not believe it. And yet he says, you don't keep the law. So we need to kind of stop and take a little break here and figure out what exactly is this law that they're not keeping. What is the law that they're not keeping? When we look at the law, there's a lot of different ways that we can think about it. The word, the title, the law, in both Hebrew and Greek was encompassed several different things. One, it could mean what we refer to as the Tanakh, which is what we call, as Christians, the Old Testament. Okay, Jewish people would call it the Tanakh. It is the law, the writings, and the prophets. Okay? The law, which would be the first 5 books, the Torah, the writings, which would be all those books like Job and Psalms and Song of Solomon, and the prophets, which would be like Isaiah and Jeremiah and all the minor prophets. And they would call this whole collection of writings the law. It could refer to just the first 5 books of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Or it could refer to the 613 laws found in the Torah. 613 of them. By the way, not all of them apply to everybody. Some only apply to men, some only apply to women, some only apply to priests. There's no way that you can keep all of them because some of them simply don't apply to you. Or it could be the teachings, both written and oral. So beyond the 613, it could be a reference to the teachings that followed, expanding on and interpreting these laws. So what exactly is Jesus talking about when he says the law? Well, here's what I think. The teachings written in oral, God's truth. Here's what I think. If you look at how the rabbis of Jesus' time and following divided the law, they divide it differently than maybe you've heard. Now, I've given a whole sermon on the law before. You can find it. It was in 2014. It's called The Law. You can go onto our Facebook page, or you can go onto our, YouTube. Yeah, that place where you people keep all those videos. Yeah, that thing. Just you young people in your videos. You're so good at that. You know. Anyway, YouTube. You can go on YouTube and you can find me, and you'll see me there, and I look older and No, I look younger, so I don't know what I look, right? You can go on there, you can take a look and see my whole big sermon on the law and get some more detail about this. But the way that the rabbis divided it up is different than how we divided it up. Oftentimes, I'm sure many of you have heard it said, well, there was the ceremonial law and there was the moral law. And the ceremonial law, like what to eat, like don't eat penguins and don't eat shrimp and things like that, don't eat lobsters. That's all gone. All that ceremonial stuff is gone. But the moral stuff stays. And of course, defining which one is moral and which one not kind of changes depending on who's doing the interpretation or who's making up the list or whatever their particular sin is. I'm sure it doesn't make the moral list. But the way that the Jewish people divided it up was this. One set was called the obligations between God and man, and the other was called the obligations between man and his neighbor. And in the first set, you find things like love the Lord with all your heart, mind, and soul. And these were referred to as the works of the law, the works that you must do. These were things like circumcision and eating kosher. These were things like keeping the Sabbath. These were all considered the works of the law. We have a term that we call this the holiness code, how to be holy. Okay? On the other side, the obligations between man and his neighbor, these are things like love your neighbor as yourself. These were known as the justices. Things like don't murder, don't oppress the poor. Okay? This is known as the righteousness code. And there's a big difference between the two. You see, if you broke one of the works of the law, if you didn't do one of the works of the law, you were considered unclean. And oftentimes you had to sit out a certain time period from visiting the temple, and you had to go through a ritual to cleanse yourself and stuff like that. You were unclean. And that was, not good, but it wasn't going to be something that's going to send you off to hell for eternity. You just kind of had to clean yourself up. On the other side, the righteousness code, the justice code, if you broke one of those, you became unrighteous. And that's where sin truly lay. Is that if you were unrighteous or treated other people in an unrighteous manner. Unrighteousness was a much bigger issue than being unclean. Unclean you can fix. Unrighteous, you can't. So in the law, the Jewish leaders are focused on the works of the law. And in fact, they have mutated the teaching on the works of the law. They're beginning to see the works of the law as not just making you unclean, not just making you unholy, but as actually making you unrighteous for not doing these things. And they begin to imply that anybody who doesn't keep the works are evil people. Jesus, on the other hand, is focused on the justices of the law. And if you go back to that sermon that I did on the law, you'll see how Jesus taught this, how Paul would later teach this, that the justices are much more important than the works. And the thing that has passed away in the law is all the works, that we're not responsible for keeping any of the works anymore. Jesus is focused on the justices, things like showing love, showing mercy, showing compassion. These were important. And when you read through the Sermon on the Mount, this is what you're going to see. In fact, Jesus would confront the Pharisees on more than one occasion. One time he says to them, you guys spend all your time tithing every little bit, even of your mint and your rue. You take your herbs and you even cut off a little tenth of them and give those. See, that was a work. Tithing was a work. And you're so focused on that, but you neglect the weightier things of the law, justice and mercy and compassion. And he called them out on that. And they were quite upset because they thought they were doing really well. They were doing all the works, which makes them look really holy or really clean, and yet they weren't showing love and mercy and compassion. So what exactly was the purpose of the law? Well, it depends on which one you're talking about. Okay, if you're talking about the holiness code, the works of the law promoted separation from the cultures around them, to remind them constantly that they were God's people. It served as a guardian until faith came and the works were no longer needed. When the original Tanakh was being collected and put together and edited, they had stories, they had oral traditions, they had some writings, but that had never really been put together, never really collected, never sort of assembled all together until the Jewish people were in Babylon under the Babylonian captivity. That's really when most of the Old Testament kind of began to get put together, especially the earlier books. And they chose the stories and they emphasized certain things because they wanted to emphasize that we are a holy and separate people. When you're living in another culture, when you no longer have your own land and you've been taken and you've been placed in the middle of another culture, it was important to them to remember, hey, we're called out, we're separate, we're different, and we need to emphasize these differences. When they first entered into the promised land, God told them, as he reveals to them, look, when you go into this land, you are not to be like the people of the land. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. Don't do any of these things that these people do because you're going to be different. And I want you to be different. I want you to be unique. I want you to be peculiar. I want you to be totally strange. So they recognize that you're called out and separate. So the idea was we got to keep you separate from the cultures around you. And so when you look at many of the works, it marks them as very, very different people. The way that they dressed, the way that they ate, some of the practices that they were involved in marked them as separate people. And that's what the purpose of the works were. To constantly remind them that you've been called out to be separate from everybody else. But that is not true today. Are we as modern day Christians supposed to be separate from everybody else? There are some people who will tell you yes, and they promote a false culture war that doesn't really exist. We're not to be separate. Let me tell you this right now. Think about the parable of the sower and the seeds. What good would it be to take those seeds and keep them in the jar? They got to be spread out. Otherwise, none of them are going to grow. The word needs to go out. I think too often we hunker down in our private little clubs and we don't get out there into the world where we need to be. Jesus said it this way, you don't take a light and hide it under a bushel. We're not separate from this world anymore. We are to go out into the world and to change the world, not to hunker down in our private clubs. So that was the purpose of the law. That was the purpose of the works, to keep them separate, and it served as a guardian of their until faith and the works were no longer needed. There was going to be a time period that would come that would say, you know what, you don't need to be separate anymore because now you have faith. And with this faith, you can now go out into the world and change it. This is a verse from Galatians. It says, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, as is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. See, if you're trying to live your life under the works of the law by making myself completely separate and all perfect and holy and all clean, forget it. You're not going to do it. You just can't. There's no way to accomplish that. You're going to fail at some point. Clearly, no one relies on the law is justified before God because the righteous will live by faith. And it is faith that is going to make us righteous. It is faith and faithfulness to God and to justice that is going to make us righteous, not the works of the law. Before the coming of this faith, continuing in Galatians, we were held in custody under the law, locked up until the faith that was to come could be revealed. So that law was our guardian until Christ came that we might be justified by faith. Now that this faith has come, we no longer are under a guardian. A guardian, a tutor, sort of like a schoolmaster. See, until faith came, they needed somebody to kind of keep them under control. And that's what all these little laws were for, to keep them under control. To say, you've got to behave yourselves and act all separate. And once faith came, they didn't need those rules anymore. And so Paul and the early apostles all taught that, hey, all these things are gone. All these little works of the law, these are all gone. You don't need to do these anymore. And that is how the faith came to the Gentiles. You don't have to be circumcised to be a Christian. You don't have to avoid eating pork to be a Christian. You don't have to make sure you're not wearing mixed fabrics to be a Christian. Those works of the law are not important anymore. It's faith and righteousness. The justice codes are still in effect. Jesus uses a great lesser to greater argument here. Showing again his great rabbinical skill, he uses this one. If circumcision, which is allowed on the Sabbath, a work on just one part of a man, that makes it lesser, then healing the whole body, which is greater, should be even more allowed. If you look at it like this, here's this work of the law, circumcision, but if the child's 8th day of life falls on a Sabbath, you go ahead and circumcise them, even though you're not supposed to work. There's an exception within the law that, well, we got to do this. And we're just talking about one part of a man. You're all mad at me because I did a miracle. I came in here, I healed the man at the pool of Bethesda on a Sabbath. And you're angry with me about that because I healed his entire body. If you're allowed to do something to one part of him, why can't I do something to the whole of him? I restored his entire life. Is that not greater? Should there not be an exception within the works of the law for that? But even more than that, Jesus takes it further. The justice acts about giving this man his life back, about showing mercy, about showing compassion, about showing love to this man far outweighs anything within the works of the law. And yet, where were they focused? You broke one of the works of the law. And we want to kill you for that. By the way, when he says this, why are you trying to kill me? They say to him, you're demon-possessed. Please understand that that is a Hebrew idiom because they believe that mental illness was from demons. That was a way of saying you're crazy. You're crazy. Nobody's trying to kill you. They're not actually accusing him of being demon-possessed. Jesus tells this story. This is an incident that happened between him and the Jewish leaders at a different time. At the time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. We know that you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. And you'd think, well, what's the big deal? They're walking through a grain field, they grab a little head of grain, they chew on it, because they're hungry. Well, that's considered work. That's gathering up food. That's a no-no. He answered, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priest. Jesus' argument is this, that the needs of people override the works of the law. Can you imagine if you saw somebody hungry and starving, and you went, I'm sorry, it's the Sabbath today. I'm not allowed to work. I can't give you any food. But God bless you. Have a nice one. Does that make any sense? And this is what Jesus is saying. Human needs outweigh the works of the law. Jesus goes on to say, or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, and catch these words, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. And Jeff read that particular phrase earlier. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. This comes from a quote from Hosea. Mercy, what side of the law does that follow on? The justices. Sacrifice, the whole sacrificial system, what side of the law does that fall on? The works. And God is telling his people, the reason I'm disciplining you is because I want you to follow the justices of the law because they're more important than the works. And you guys keep doing the works and doing the works and doing the works, and I'm tired of your works because your heart's not engaged in it. You're not practicing the justices. You're not practicing mercy and love and compassion. That's why I'm disciplining you. Not because you're doing temple sacrifices wrong. That's not why I'm disciplining you. It's not because you're wearing mixed fabrics. That's not why I'm disciplining you. I'm disciplining you because you have broken the justices. You're oppressing widows. You're oppressing the poor. That's what I'm upset about. And so Jesus constantly, every time he gets busted on breaking one of these works of the law, says, God says it's more important for justice than the works of the law. How do we act this out in our own life? How do we worship God by living this out, by living out his word in our own life? Well, here's the question for you. Are you stuck in works? Are you stuck in works? For those of you who have grown up around the church, we know the works. We know all the things we're supposed to do to look like good little Christians, right? And I got to tell you, I've heard all of these things in my time period here at ODM. I've heard former members look at us and they're very upset with us because we put the scriptures up on PowerPoint on the overhead. And they're all mad because that doesn't encourage people to bring their Bible. Nobody brings their Bible because the scriptures are up on PowerPoint. They need to have their Bible in their hand. And you try very patiently to explain, doesn't that seem kind of like a little bit of a work of the law? You know? Technically, if I really want my Bible in my hand, I can pull out my phone. It's right there. That doesn't count, by the way. It's got to be one of those leather-bound King Jamesy things, right? Just right. They count as being properly Christian enough, and that somehow, if you're not carrying around your little leather-bound King Jamesy Bible, you're not Christian enough, and you're break. But isn't that just a work? We had a former member of the church here who used to criticize the praise band on a regular basis because he would come to us after Sunday and he would point out something about the praise songs. I kid you not. He would say, all throughout the praise songs, the name of Jesus was only mentioned 3 times. It was only on the screen 3 times, or 5 times, or 2 times. And he would tell us every Sunday how many times Jesus' names appeared in the lyrics of the songs. Because some of them were about God, and some of them just said you, some of them said Lord. But he would count the names of Jesus every week. And we weren't being Jesus enough for him. It's not up there enough. You're doing it wrong. This is not real praise. And how do you explain to this individual as you try to take them aside and very nicely say, you know what? If you're too busy counting the number of times that the word Jesus appears, you're not worshiping. You're counting. Your heart is not engaged because you're focused on the works. And by the way, his name isn't Jesus anyway, it's Yeshua. Why doesn't it say Yeshua up there? Because we're Americans. We just change everybody's name so we can say it. That's why. Are you stuck in the works? I got to tell you, I remember when I was working as a youth pastor, I had a senior pastor come to me and question me about how many hours a day I was praying. How many hours a day are you praying? I'm like going, hours? You do realize I'm a youth pastor, right? I pray constantly. Every time I walk into the room, oh God, just get me through this meeting. It's a tough job as a youth pastor. Okay? But no, they literally wanted me to keep a record of how many hours a day I was praying. Make sure you mark it all down, right? Because the goal was 4 hours a day. If you're not praying 4 hours a day, well, you're not qualified for ministry. I'm like, really? Four hours? Right. Okay? Have you read the whole Bible once a year? Are you doing that? If not, you're not a good enough Christian. I remember when I was growing up in my little Christian school, if you couldn't recite all the books of the Bible in order, you weren't a good enough Christian. And I'm like, what are all these works? Where are all these all coming from? Well, how can you not possibly know the 66 books of the Bible? And then if you really want to make one of those people's heads explode, tell them, well, some versions have 69 and some have 72. Depends on which version you're reading. Just never mind. I won't talk about that. Can you name the 72 books of the Bible? Anyway. Are we stuck in works? Are we looking at the wrong things? Are there not enough hymns compared to worship choruses? Are we using the wrong interpretation, the wrong version of the Bible for you, the wrong translation of the Bible for you? Are we not saying Jesus enough in the songs? Do you not like the color of the altar or something? Are we stuck in works? Because we need to get past that kind of stuff. God doesn't care whether you carry a big leather-bound King James Bible. God doesn't care. You know what he cares about? Did you feed that person who was hungry? God doesn't care how many times you sing Jesus in your songs. He cares whether or not you're really worshiping. God doesn't care that much about how you dress. What he really cares about is that you act righteously and love your neighbor. Any law, any regulation, any tradition that does not promote justice isn't God's way. You tell me how carrying an NIV Bible as opposed to a King James Bible, or carrying a King James Bible as opposed to a NRSV Bible, promotes justice. Tell me how that promotes justice. Tell me how that promotes mercy or compassion. What that does is create exclusive little clubs of, we have the right one and you have the wrong one and you're out. That's not mercy, that's not compassion, that's not love, that's not incorporating and including your neighbor. That's exactly opposite of what God wants. And so we need to constantly be checking with ourselves. Are we getting just a little too religious? Are we just getting a little too focused on works and looking like a Christian? Somebody once criticized me, I noticed that you don't have any kind of indication. You don't wear like little Christian crosses and you don't have like anything on your car to, spread the word and tell them that you're a Christian. I said, I'm not putting anything on my car like a fish that's going to tell them, the way I drive, no, there's not a chance. I want them to think I'm a hell-bound sinner the way I drive. The example, don't do that, right? Why don't you have bumper stickers? Why don't you wear, why don't you wear more religious shirts and stuff like that? I don't need those things. You know what? If you just go out there and love people and show compassion and mercy, they're going to figure out what you are. You aren't going to have to advertise it and try to tell them and try to convince them, well no, I'm a Christian. See, I got the cross and the Bible and the bumper sticker. You don't need those things if you're living this. If you don't do God's way, then you won't recognize Jesus or understand his teaching. The religious leaders of his time did not understand anything Jesus was saying because they didn't practice God's will. They were too focused on the works and they didn't understand the justices. And so when Jesus keeps coming to them and going, hey, let's love our neighbor. Hey, let's show mercy. Let's show compassion. They're like, we have no idea what you're talking about. Where are you getting these crazy ideas? God, I'm getting them from God. That's where I'm getting them. We know for a fact that we have lost generations within the church. That if you look across America, churches are dying every day. Thousands of churches close every month. Literally because their congregation ages out. And many of them just simply die off. And you say, well, where are all the younger people? Where are all these vaunted millennials that we keep talking about? Millennials don't want to go to church. You ask them why, and there was research done. You ask a millennial, why don't you want to go to church? And they're like, I don't want to go to church because, and they'll name all the works of the law, because they expect me to do all these things which have nothing to do with Christianity. I see too many hypocrites within the church. Well, that's true. Where they say one thing and do another, where they're all focused on the works and not focused on justice. They see us as being too political. They see us as being too anti-LGBT. They see us in a very negative light because we've wandered off into doing the works, making us look like what we think Christians should look like, rather than actually being Christians and living out the justices. I know some people out there who have not darkened the doorway of a church for years, but they know how to live God's will. And they're out there doing it. I've seen them because they're out there on the streets feeding the hungry. They're the ones out there building homes for the homeless. They're the ones out there protesting for justice and demanding that we treat everybody equally. I'm like going, you're walking according to God. Of course, people focus on works, be like, well, they can't be a Christian. They haven't been in church for years. Can I actually say that God doesn't care whether you show up to church every week? Especially if you're just focused on the works. You're just going through the motions. It's much better if you show up here on a Sunday morning and you're focused on the justices, on loving God and loving your neighbor. That's what God wants. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. But you've got to do his will. First you hear his will, and then as you do it, then you know that is his will. Once you start doing it, then you understand it. Jesus finishes up this section of Scripture by saying this: stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. Now, he's not saying, don't judge people by the way they look. That's not what he's saying at all. Again, this is a little bit of an idiom. What this means is this: stop doing what looks or sounds good to you by appearances, what looks or sounds good to you, and start doing God's will. Make a right judgment. Start doing God's will. Stop doing what looks or sounds good to you and start doing God's will. That's what he's trying to say to them. Stop worrying about how you appear to everybody else. Stop worrying about, do I have the right Bible? I have people come to me. This is one of those topics that just frustrates me to no end. People constantly coming up to me, well, which translation should I have? And I'm like, I don't care. Which one will you read? You can carry around the right translation. It ain't going to help until you crack the thing open and read it. Okay, I got to go off on a tangent here. I'm already off on a tangent, but I'll do it anyway. True story. I had a student come to my office one day, right? Comes to my office. They're not doing very well in the class. What can I do to improve my grades? And I said, well, here, are you doing what I told you about how to use your textbook? Let me see your textbook. And they handed me their textbook out of their bag. They pulled it out of their bag and they handed it to me. Because I wanted to check to see if they were making the kind of notes and using it the way I told them to. They pulled their textbook out of the bag and they handed it to me, and it was still in the shrink wrap. To which I immediately removed the shrink wrap and said, there, that'll help. Start there. I already opened it now. You're going to get less for returning it. Trust me. Go ahead, mark it up like I told you. I don't know, read it or something. It doesn't matter what translation you have if you don't read it and do it. The words are just tools. The words of the songs are just tools. You've got to engage your heart. Otherwise, it's not really worship. Stop doing what looks or stop worrying about, do you look Christian enough? You all look fine. Some of you look fabulous. Nice haircut, by the way. Y'all look fine. You're going to look a lot better when you're adorned with righteousness and mercy, when you're out there promoting peace and justice and equality. Those are the beautiful garments that you can be adorned with if you really want. With that, we're going to end. Praise team, come on back up. I'll close in prayer.